So, okay, I'm going to start. Thanks for everyone who made it here. and if not, they're going to get the video. So, yeah, so I think we were talking about safety last time. And so I will continue there. I think I talked about these. And let me move my windows around so I can actually see what I'm doing. Okay, so a few more things to think about with safety. As you remember, we were talking all about safety, electrical safety issues. Something good to know, even beyond the testing stuff. Not recommended to do something like this, where you've got a bunch of wires connected into a single outlet. And the main reason for that is because you can exceed the amount of amps that the wires are spec for behind here and cause a fire in the wall. And so this obviously can cause a lot of issues. So not recommended. And then obviously there's a lot of cases where things could fail. So try to avoid that. I know sometimes it's hard to avoid with modern computers and a lot, but that's generally a good idea. Two-pronged outlets are not great. I know a lot of old houses do have them, and I think we talked about it, but it's better to have the three-prong, which is the kind that is grounded. And so you know, if you do have the two prongs, I know some older houses still have these. It's a good idea to get them grounded and in terms of safety. And then let's see here. Okay, let's see if I got that. Okay, so let's talk about lightning protection. Lightning is a problem, and depends on where you guys live, in what part of the world. And there's a nice little picture of where the most lightning is in the United States. And this is obviously the hot spot is Florida. If anyone lives in Florida, you know that. Actually, in California, we get like no lightning. So it depends on where you are. Just be aware of where you live. And lightning is an issue with amateur radio, because amateur radio being a big, having a big antenna in a lightning area can be a problem. So little example of what typical ham radio setup looks like. You know, there's an antenna right here and an antenna system, and this wire goes into actually, I think it may actually show you a diagram here. So that is a radio. That's a transceiver. And there's the antenna. And it can be a big thing like this. It could be just a wire, as I mentioned before. Some people use flagpoles. So if you live in a community where they don't let you have antennas, you can actually be an amateur radio operator and put up a flagpole, because a flagpole's legal. And use that as an antenna. And over here, this is also a part of the radio system, which is the power that goes to your house. So there's this magic element, which not everybody has. No one in California I know has one of these, but everywhere else in the world you do, which is called a lightning arrestor. And it is a special device which theoretically, if lightning hits your tower, will force the power, that lightning strike, to go to ground rather than to your house. And this is called a grounding system. And ground, something that we talked about with power, and it's also something that we talk about with antennas. And you really should have a good ground for both electrical and also for RF reasons, because if you have a good ground, it also helps your signal. And we're not going to talk about all that, but that's just you know, something to be aware of. There are a couple questions on the test, which we'll talk about, which are all about ground, and I'll tell you about that when we get to those, when we start going over the grounding systems. This is an example of what a ground system looks like in real time. This is a tower, and this is a bunch of very large copper straps into these And these are grounding rods that go down into the ground. I think they're usually 6 feet into the ground, something like that. And here, there's a bunch of them, and that is both for lightning protection as well as for RF reasons. Now this is a example of a panel that goes to is in someone's shack and actually goes outside to that ground, and this is a giant piece of copper, and these are all the different coaxings. And so someone who's doing this is actually a pretty good system that ensures everything is grounded and safe when there's lightning. And again, it depends on where you are, how much you need to do. Another example here of ground, and this is a giant copper strap again that goes outside, and that goes to a ground system outside. And this is a giant piece of copper and all these giant straps. And this is a very, very, very good ground system. And I haven't seen very many people with something that's good, but this is the best. This is the best way that you want to do it. And one of the questions on the test is, how do you want to ground your system? And you want it all grounded to one central point. And so this is the one central point here. And you'll see this is it's kind of like a tree and branch thing. And that is how these are all connected. So I do have to say most of the folks I know don't have anything nearly as fancy as this, but so you've seen it. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when lightning strikes a ham radio system. So one of the common ways that this happens is when lightning hits an electrical power line, and the energy looks for ground. As everyone knows, lightning is trying to connect with ground, and it goes to the nearest ground point. In this case, it's going through the house. Another risk area, of course, is the antenna. Same thing there. And the best scenario is for the lightning to hit the tower and go straight into the ground. So that guy with the fancy schmancy grounding system around his tower, that does a great job of taking lightning to ground. Now, say you didn't have a very good ground system. Well, so this tower wasn't grounded. What's going to travel through there, and it's going to go through your computer, or not your computer, your radio, and it will. And I've actually seen a radio that this happened to, and it will fry the inside of your radio, go through the plug or your ground system and down into the earth, and it'll destroy all of your equipment. And if you're touching it, you might also get zapped. So that is the problem with the ground, not having a good ground in the system. Okay, so let's talk about direct current. So direct current is, and we talked a little bit about this, is what's generally coming out of your car battery as opposed to out of the wall. And direct current batteries, this is some example of what their cranking amps are. And 12 volts is less voltage, which is one factor, but it does have quite a bit of amperage. So this is a power supply, and just for example here, the red is usually the hot lead, or it always is the hot lead, and the black is the ground. And you got to make sure that when you have equipment hooked up, that you have the proper polarity on the power. And we can talk. Well, I think we'll have a few questions about that we'll discuss. Okay, so let's see here. Red and black. Okay, so we're not going to do this. Let's skip past this. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide.
Ben.
Yes.
Just to clarify, the difference between amperage and voltage and what that means.
Yeah. So there's actually there's actually a little bit of electronics that you need to know to understand voltage and amperage. And I can pop up, let me pop up a little whiteboard. That's actually one of the questions that's going to be on the test. And let me see if I can find this whiteboard. And okay, can everyone see this whiteboard right now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we saw a little bit about let's see here. Undo. There we go. So we saw a little bit about schematics, and there's one little bit of electronics that you need to know to pass the test, and that is voltage and current and resistance. And this isn't the terms that they use directly on the test, but this is the way I learned it. So I'll tell you what this is. V equals IR is a math formula that you have to learn. And what happens is you have, I'm drawing a little diagram here. In all electronics, you have something that has a power supply. And there's a negative side and a positive side. So think about that as a battery, or some other kind of voltage source, and that the amount of voltage between that is the voltage, and so you have something which is the load, and that's typically shown as a resistor. And so and this is generally ground right here, by the way. So there's this math relationship between voltage, which is how much power. So if you think about this as a battery, it's, I think in the, actually someone put it in there, yeah, it's electrical potential. I think it might be E equals IR in the test. But this is like a battery. So if you had a 9-volt battery, that would be 9 volts right here. That would be, if you took a measurement, that's what you get. So I'm going to undo that real quick. So the relationship is the current is how much current going from through the resistor, and that's the relationship. So V equals IR, and it changes depending on what V is. And if you have a lot of, so this, if you think of this as a light bulb, is, some light bulbs use more energy than others, and that changes how much current is going through them. So this is one which you may want to look up. I think the book has it, but you can figure out any voltage and current and resistance a relationship, and using just simple math. So I equals V divided by R, and so on and so forth. So that is one of the pieces of math that you're gonna have to know for the test. And I can talk more about that later when we get to those questions on the example test. But anyway, that's the electronics part of it. And yeah, some of this, you don't actually use this doing most of the radio stuff, but they want you to know the basics. And that's, because, this can be a technical hobby, and they want you to have at least some basics of what's going on.
And then where does the amperage fit into this?
This is in amps. So this is measured in amps. And V equals volts. My writing on this board is horrible. R is ohms. That's the measurements. So when they say amperage, is talking about how much of this current is going through, and this is always in amps. This is volts. This is always in ohms. So. And we can come back to that. So let me save that. Okay, so let me go back to the other window. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Q signals. So in amateur radio operators sometimes use terms that are specific to the hobby. And one of them, which no one else uses, are called Q signals. Q signals are a lot of these may have originated back in the day of the telegraph, believe it or not, short ways to get information back, and some of them are ham radio folks who had just adopted and set it for themselves. So QRM is for example, man-made noise. So if someone hears some noise that they know is from a power line or from interference from a piece of electronics, that's called QRM. And that is, and sometimes you'll hear people say that QR Mary, QRM. And just so you know what Q signals are about. Another one, let's see if I can. Another one is called QRN. Some people say call QR Nancy using the phonetics, and that is noise detected by caused by lightning or by other natural noise. So there are actually things that you can hear on amateur radio that are from lightning. So, for example, on high frequency bands, you can actually hear when there's a storm nearby, or even a storm 400 miles away, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of things that you can actually hear that are on the radio bands that are natural. And so QRN is one of them. You can actually hear, one of the neatest ones is you can hear the aurora borealis. So if you're transmitting signals to someone, for example, from here in the United States over the poles to Russia, you can actually hear the flutter when the aurora borealis is active. So anyway, that's QRN, Q signals. Another one here, just so you've heard it, is QRP. And that is when you're communicating with somebody who is operating on very low power. So for example, if they're hiking or in the mountains or using something that's very low power, that is QRP. And most of the folks who are off portable are usually running QRP. There's some people who do this just for fun at home. It is a challenge because you don't have as much signal, but that is QRP. This is a real common one, and you'll hear amateur radio operators ask, "What is your QTH?" And QTH is where do you live? What is your where is your residence? So usually it's where your house is, but if you're operating, say you're camping or something like that, you will say where you are. And yeah, I don't think anyone uses "What's your 20" on amateur radio. I think it's more of a CB thing. So. Okay, so QSL is another one that's worth knowing. And QSL is I understand or I received your transmission okay. So for example, someone says, hey, did you get my transmission? And you'll say QSL. And that's just one way of understanding, having someone understand that they got your message. And one thing.
Are you required to use these Q codes, or they're just common practice?
They're common practice, so you're not required to use them. A lot of people do, and it is useful to be aware of what they are. And usually, when you start operating, you just print out a list of them, and there's only about, these are probably the ones you'll see the most anyway. So there's only 4 or 5, and you'll get used to it. So just an example, QSL is it is is a card that people actually send to each other. It's a postcard, and it's kind of it is kind of fun to send these. Maybe it's old-fashioned, but you can actually make, when you make contact with people, they will send you a QSL. They do it electronically as well, though the postcard's kind of fun, and it tells you a little bit about them, and you get a little idea of you can collect them. Some people collect them. So that is Q signals, and I think that's the last on this slide. So let me open up the next presentation. Okay, let's see. Oh, I don't need this one. Just a second. Okay. Just a second here. Still looking for the right one. Okay, let's talk about the amateur radio service. Okay, everyone see the amateur radio service slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk about the amateur radio service. I know I assume I haven't covered this yet, right? No? Okay. Okay, so there's the agency I think I mentioned before that's in charge of amateur radio is the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And there's actually a number of reasons they have amateur radio. And this is why we actually have any spectrum and the whole hobby exists. And those are actually some questions that you'll run across on the test, and we'll go over those. But one is a public service. So you'll see that amateur radio operators, obviously you guys have followed me and you know, it's not just me, but there's a lot of amateur radio operators who do a lot of public service in disasters and emergencies. And it's not uncommon. And they actually even do things like marathons and bike rides, anything where it would be helpful to have radio communications, and sometimes even just for help, but mostly it's for radio communications. Out here in California, there's something called Baker to Vegas. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's actually it is a marathon. Well, I don't know if it's a marathon. It's a race that the sheriff's departments and law enforcement, they go from Baker, California, all the way to Las Vegas. And there's absolutely no cell phone signal the whole way. And so hundreds of amateur radio operators actually go out and help support that and make sure that there's someone to report safety issues and that sort of thing. So those are very common. And if you get your license, you'll see it's something that's that you can get involved with. And one thing here, I have a t-shirt. There's a t-shirt that has this on here that says "When all else fails, amateur radio." And I used to laugh and say, hey, there's no possible way that would be the case. But after having seen hurricanes and a couple of the other fires and other things, unfortunately, it's all too common nowadays where amateur radio is the only way to get in and out. So, okay, so other things that you can do with amateur radio is you can talk to other. This is obviously from the Boy Scout presentation, but you can talk to anybody in other countries. And one thing that the FCC has amateur radio for is international goodwill. And the first 25 stations I talked to on high frequency radio when I first got my license were all in Russia. And it's very interesting when you are able to talk to people so easily. You get a sense of how small the world is. And so even now with these kind of disasters, you can hear people in other parts of the world, and so now there's actually people who we can talk to that you can't actually go visit now, obviously. And so that's one of the reasons why amateur radio exists, is international goodwill. We talked a little about the electronics aspect of amateur radio, and one of the other reasons that the FCC actually allows amateur radio, and the reason why we even have spectrum, as you guys may know, they sell spectrum for millions and millions and millions of dollars, and the reason they reserve some for us to play with is because they want experimentation. And so since the beginning of amateur radio, there's been a lot of inventions by amateurs that have resulted in technology advances. And so that's why they have that available. And that technology has been used in a lot of places outside of amateur radio. That one of the interesting ones is if anyone remembers the whole cave rescue a few years ago in Thailand. If you imagine, if you are in a cave, there is no way to communicate with anyone underground. Radios don't work underground. there's no way to use your cell phone underground. And it turns out an amateur radio operator developed a system using very low frequency radio waves, or I don't know if the sound waves or whatever. Anyway, the system, he used a lot of stuff that was used in amateur radio and translated into a system that works underground for cave communications. So the cave communications that were used in that rescue were actually developed by amateur radio operators. And the last piece of the FCC's reason for amateur radio service is for communication skills. One thing is, when you are in amateur radio, you do learn a lot about communications, talking to other people. It's especially for the younger generation now, it's kind of hard for people to talk to people who they don't know. And when you get on the radio, you get over that fairly quickly. And you do learn some communication skills, making sure that you're clear when you're speaking to folks and that sort of thing. So that's the other reason the FCC says they have amateur radio. And there's a bunch of questions on those, and we'll go over those later too. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about basic operating for amateur radio, things that you can do. This is a general, talking to anyone across the world, talking to people on the radio. Right now, amateur radio operators in my neighborhood have been getting on actually 4 times a day just to make sure everyone's okay, and trading tips on where you can buy toilet paper and bread and that sort of thing. And so that's general operating. This is called amateur radio direction finding, and it's also called fox hunting. And it's a interesting combination of radio and physical fitness, and using a map and compass. And people do that for fun. It turns out that's actually how you also track wildlife. So if anyone ever has heard about the wildlife biologists finding wildlife using a radio transmitter, this is how they do it. The same thing. You can also use this to find interference. And amateur radio operators frequently use this to find people who are abusing VHF radios and calling Mayday on Coast Guard channels. That's happened more than once. So that is amateur radio direction finding. Another thing that amateur radio operators can do is actually communicate with spacecraft. And we'll go over that, but there's a bunch of questions in terms of what is the space station and what is not a space station on the test. That happens that if you are a technician class amateur radio operator, someone who's just starting out, you can actually communicate with the International Space Station. And the ISS, occasionally you'll have astronauts actually call people and on Earth and just give them a chat. I think there's an astronaut, Serena, forget her last name, who was actually randomly contacting amateur radio operators just for fun when she was off break. But usually they do it for schools, and so you can do that. There's also a number of amateur satellites, and so there's actually a number of ways where we can communicate with other people using a satellite that we've launched. And it's kind of a neat thing to do if you're interested in that. And in fact, you can even do things like bounce signals off of the moon. A few years ago, an amateur radio operator actually found a NASA space satellite, a science satellite or space probe that NASA thought they lost. And the amateur radio operator actually figured out that it repowered up like several years later after they thought they had lost it. And I think they've reactivated that satellite. So if you're interested in that, you can always go look that up. But a lot of space stuff with amateur radio. And mentioned the ISS. There's a lot of neat things you can do. This is somebody who actually stuck their radio on a bicycle so they could use the radio while they ride, which is kind of interesting. There's a lot of digital communications, so there's a lot of different ways to to transmit data using digital communications. I think anyone who's followed me during the fires knows that we actually have mesh networks here, a very high-speed internet system where we can actually send data at the same speed as the internet without the need for any infrastructure. So not that I would ever think it would go down, but if the internet went down, we would still have our own network. And we do things like send videos back and forth. You can do all the video chat. We can do the equivalent of Zoom on our own network. And it's more of a fun thing. During the fires, though, it was useful. We ran our own network, even though I think Spectrum went down and everyone else went down. And we were able to get people in areas that had no internet service onto the internet for information. So a lot of interesting things you can do there. Let's see, talked about that. There was a thing a few years ago called National Park on the Air, and this is operating out in the national parks. I do that a lot. If you go hiking, it's just a fun thing to do. So Summits on the Air, and this is where you hike to the top of a hill and try to make contacts. So these are just some of the fun things you do. Kind of a way to broaden your skills, and you learn some things, and it's kind of fun. You can also receive video signals from space, and this was I guess back from, I'm not sure when this was, if it was from the space station or whatever, or if it was from the mirror, but this is an image that they sent, and you can do that. That's kind of fun. I mentioned moon bounce. You can actually bounce signals off the moon into another station somewhere else on Earth. A lot of electronics, as I mentioned. If you're interested in building your own circuits, there's a lot of opportunities there. So that is a technical aspect of this hobby. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about amateur radio licenses. I don't know if I remember talking about this, but the basic level is technician, and this is the one that we're working on now. I'm trying to get you all the information so that you can get your technician license. And this is mostly local communications. This is talking in your own region or in your own city on a handheld, and that's typically VHF and UHF. So the bands that you would use for local communications. General is you have to have a little bit more electronics and more practices, and you can do, this is where you can start doing shortwave bands and communicate around the world. So that's a high frequency. And then the very top one is extra class, and that means that you've passed a bunch of advanced electronics theories and practices, and you can work on all bands, and you can also administer license exams. So I'm actually extra class, so I can help issue licenses, and it takes 3 amateur radio operators and to administer a test. So we'll figure that out with the whole physical isolation thing. So, and those are called volunteer examiners, VECs. So let's talk about emergency calls real quick. We all live in areas where there's major disasters. You know, if you're on the East Coast, I'm sure everyone knows hurricanes. West Coast, we have earthquakes, tsunamis, wilderness, wildfires. Middle of the country has tornadoes. There's all sorts of disasters. You can, so the important thing to know with radio is that anyone can use a radio when it's a life and death situation. So you guys, even though you don't have a license yet, you can pick up a radio and make an emergency call. And so we'll talk about that. What you need to do first, of course, is you got to listen. And then if you had to make a call, you can do several things. One is you could say break, break. That is an indication to people that you need to make a contact. You can also say Mayday. I think everyone has heard that before, Mayday. And if you forget that word, you can also just say emergency. So all those are things that you can say on the radio if you need to make an emergency call, and that's always the case. So it's legal to always make you can always make an emergency call on a radio, even if you don't have a license. And in fact, if you guys have seen before, there's been cases where maybe someone's run across a police trooper who's been shot or something like that, and they picked up the radio and made a call, and that's legal to do. So that is an important thing to know about emergency calls. Okay. Just for fun, anyone know what this is? Yes, that's that's SOS. 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 dots. SOS. And you can also use that for people will recognize that as an emergency. Now, I know that sometimes people have been on a mountaintop with a flashlight and needed help, and if you click SOS, someone's going to come and try to find you, and most likely. So that is pretty universal. One thing I do have to say is that on the non-licensed radio bands, so like CB and also especially FRS, the family radio. The other day I was listening locally here, and there was a little kid running around yelling "Mayday" on those radios. So you do have to keep that in mind on some of those unlicensed bands with kids on them. So, okay, let's talk about amateur radio equipment. Just so you have an idea of what types of ham radio equipment there is. This is a typical base station transceiver. This is usually where you would have, if you've heard the term ham shack, this is usually a very big piece of equipment, and it doesn't move very much, and it's usually heavy. So this is an example of a ham shack, someone with a lot of radios. You don't have to have something so fancy, but at least you've got an idea of what a ham shack is. And this is a mobile transceiver. So a lot of amateur radio operators will use their mobile radios more than anything else. In most states, I'm not sure if all, but most states, you can use amateur radio operator even though you're driving. And so, of course, you have to use it safely, but there's an exception in most of the rules that you can use amateur radio while driving. So even though you can't use your phone, you can use your amateur radio. Of course, you have to drive safely, but there's an exception there, and that's mainly because amateur radio operators do a lot of public service, and you need a way to communicate while you're mobile. Okay, so this is just a funny picture, and some people get carried away. Don't do this. So this is a handheld, call them an HT or a handy talkie, and this is what most amateur radio operators have. At least one of these. I'll have to say that this week we found out there's people who didn't have one of these and are looking for them. The reason why is because they had gotten licensed as an amateur radio operator and never really got into it, and now they're stuck at home and wondering what's going on with the whole disaster with this pandemic. They're going, it would be nice to have a handheld. So we're trying to get a few people set up with those. But this is a handy talkie. And there's all sorts of these. There's a bunch from China, which are a little iffy about using. But they can be anywhere from $25 to hundreds of dollars. And the best ones I like, and everyone will have different opinions, are the Japanese ones for about $125. So,
Ben,
yeah.
What's the company or the make model of the ones you're talking about? Japan.
The Japanese ones, the entry level one, I'm going to type into the chat thing. The Yaesu FT60. That's a good starter radio. And it's a little more expensive, but it receives aircraft frequencies and it receives all the police and fire frequencies. It's really easy to use. And if you do get one of those, get it with the AA. The other thing is it has a AA battery pack that goes with that that you can buy. And in an emergency, it's really, really, really useful to have a AA battery pack. A lot of the more expensive radios have lithium ion that require recharging. And during emergencies, that's kind of a pain. So I like the FT60, and they're not too expensive. So by the way, you can buy an amateur radio before your license, but you cannot transmit. That's the important thing, is you're absolutely not allowed to transmit without a license. And no one will talk to you without a license. So anyway, the EAC FT60, if you're looking at one and you want to even just be able to listen to fire and police channels, that's a pretty good one. There's a bunch of Chinese ones which are much cheaper, but the problem with those is you have to know what you're doing when you program them, and you can get in a lot of trouble because you can transmit on police and fire frequencies, which you really don't want to do. And so I recommend a full-fledged amateur radio, at least until you know what you're doing. Okay, so by the way, so with the HT, there's something called a repeater. I don't know if I talked about a repeater or not yet, but repeaters are these big towers up on top of mountaintops. And what they do is they allow you to transmit your radio up to the top of a mountain and onto the other side. So this is really useful in an area where there's a lot of mountains, or if you just want to go a far distance. An HT usually doesn't have a lot of power. So these only have about 5 watts. And tall hills will get in the way, buildings will get in the way, and that sort of thing. But if you have something high up on a hill, a repeater, this actually sends a signal up and it sends it back down, and it will repeat, and sometimes it'll make it louder. It'll amplify that signal. So it is a very handy thing. It's almost like a cell phone tower, except for it's only amateur radio operators who are there, and it's a lot more powerful. So the other thing you can do with repeaters is you can actually connect them with the internet. So you can actually connect these to the internet. And there's things called Echolink, and there's internet IRLP, which they'll actually bridge these across the world. Of course, if the internet goes down, that doesn't help you very much. The other nice thing is these repeaters actually are in networks. So for example, in Southern California, we can go from San Diego to Santa Barbara and beyond, all just on towers. So as long as these towers are still running, the internet can go down, the phone can go down, and this still runs. So that is a great thing about repeaters. Okay, and that's it for this. Let's see here. Okay, I'm gonna go for 10 more minutes. And so, by the way, the Alaska guys, if you are in my area in Southern California, I'd be willing to do the proctoring thing. I think the guys who are full virtual might be better right now with the whole pandemic issue, just because no one really wants to be hanging out with anybody else right now. So okay, let's see if I got that. Okay, let me find this document. Okay, we're not going to go through the full thing yet, but there is. I put out a link last week, and I'll put it out again, which has all the answers for the test, and that is the thing that we're going to go over next, and it's the right answers only. So let me find there we go. Just a second, let me bring it up. Okay, so this is the document that has the answers, the questions, and only the correct answers. And Someone asked about the Alaska proctors. No, they're for any license. So you can do that for technician, general, and extra. The other folks also, and I'll send out that information when they're fully set up. So this document here goes section by section, and it goes through each one of the questions and the correct answer. And the theory of this, of course, is that if you only see the correct answer, you could probably get through the test by just saying, oh, I've seen that before, as opposed to seeing all the wrong answers as well. So I have to say that the last class I ran with college students, some of them doing this aced the test, and the other ones didn't, missed a lot. And I think you do have to spend some time memorizing it. I suggest that hamstudy.org or the Wave Talker site, very important as you want to learn these for the test. So I'm actually going to, I'll start here just for a few of these questions, but my plan from now is to go through these and explain what this means on each of these. You still have to go and learn and memorize the questions, but at least you'll have an idea what they mean. So you'll remember, for example, this first one is which of the following is the purpose of the amateur radio service as stated in the FCC rules and regulations? And you'll recall we talked about advancing skills in the technical and communication phases of the radio art. So they want to allow you to add to technology and communications. So that's the reason for amateur radio service. This one we talked about as well. What agency regulates and enforces the rules for amateur radio service in the United States? Anything communications related in the U.S., even television and the internet, is the FCC. We talked about phonetic alphabets. And what are the FCC rules regarding use of phonetic alphabet for station identification? It is encouraged. So you don't have to use the phonetic alphabet, but it is encouraged that you use the phonetic alphabet. Some of these are just legal things you got to know and just memorize. And here it says, how many operator primary station license grants may be held by any one person? And it's one. So you can only have one amateur radio license. You can't have multiple. And so when you're licensed, you'll get one call sign. And what is proof of possession of an FCC issued operator primary license grant? The control operator's primary station license must appear in the FCC ULS consolidated licensee database. And there's a big database in the sky. And the only proof of that you're licensed is that you have to be in that database. And just for fun, let me bring this up. And then share this over here just a second. Okay, forget this screen up. I've got way too many windows open, so I'm trying to find this. Oops, that's the wrong one. You want to see all the people in Congress with COVID-19? No, you don't want that. Just a second here. Is that it? Oh, that might be it. No. License search. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so here is the FCC Universal Licensing System. And so you can look up any call sign here, and you'll get a person's address and information. So if anyone saw anyone commenting saying you're pretty brave to use your call sign as your Twitter handle, that's because you can punch my call sign in and you get my location. Or in this case, it's actually my PO box. So that is how you prove you're an amateur radar operator. So this one is W1AW is the is the Amateur Radio Relay League. And if you type that in, it should pop up. If the FCC is running, come on. Oh, and not working. And W1AW. So you click on that, and it will tell you where that is, which is 225 Main Street, Newington, Connecticut, 06111. So, you know, one thing we talked about the FRNs is that when you have a license, you do show up in a big database somewhere. So you probably want to put, I've had my home address until like 2 weeks ago. But you might also put in a PO box or something like that, or a work address. The only important thing is you have to make sure that it's something that your mail will be delivered to. So that is the FCC ULS database. So with that, I'm going to end tonight, and I will do Wednesday. I'll remember Wednesday next time. Any questions? Okay, no questions then, huh? Okay, so thanks everyone, and we will pick up again on Wednesday.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.